Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Marietta, for inviting me to speak today. And it's really an honor to be included in this course among such an amazing group of scholars. I've attended all of the other preceding lectures in this series, and like all of you, I learned so much from all of them. So as you know from your visits to the exhibition, convents served an important role in the lives of women in Renaissance Italy. And that's both for the women who were members of the monastic communities, as well as the women living in the urban areas that they served. Lay women visited their relatives in convents. They educated and sometimes boarded their daughters in convents. And they sometimes retired to convents when they were widowed. Spirituality, devotional practices were central to the lives of women in the Catholic society of 14th, 15th, and 16th century Italy. And I think, as you all saw, that the exhibition really beautifully explores the religious lives of all women and their roles as spiritual leaders within their families, educating and serving as models of religious devotion for their children. And so I just want to note that this wonderful object, which is not in the exhibition but is on view in the newly renovated Italian Renaissance Gallery, may have been displayed in a home during Holy Week leading up to Easter. And so much like a nativity or a creche scene at Christmas time, you can imagine a family moving these figures, interacting with the disciple figures in this model of the Last Supper. And so perhaps even a mother used an object like this one to instruct her children. So it's a personal favorite of mine in the MFA's collection. But of course, nuns had an even greater dedication and obligation to their faith, and with acts of devotion and guidance that served to benefit the spiritual well-being of their broader religious and secular communities. And women became nuns for various reasons. For some, it was a chosen vocation to live a life of devotion in service of their faith. For others, it was a more practical necessity for a family that couldn't afford to care for its progeny or provide a proper dowry. And you may remember that a few weeks ago when Jacqueline Mazzacchio explained to us in her lecture that this was especially true in large families with multiple daughters, which often could only afford to marry off the eldest daughter in a family. And so we know that women generally had two paths in life to choose from this very patriarchal society of Renaissance Italy, and that was marriage or monastic life. But there were times when they could follow each of these paths at different points of their lives. So for example, widows who joined convents, reminding us that women entered these communities under the changing circumstances of their lives. A widow might seek the protection that a convent could provide her, as did women who were seeking refuge from abusive husbands, or those who were unable to bear children and whose husbands wished to remarry. So they might not take, in these instances, they might not take the formal vows of sisterhood, or they might be sequestered to a different area of the convent. But nonetheless, the convent remained an option to women throughout their lives, even women who were once married. So what was life like for women who entered the convent? So firstly, I want us to consider what kinds of convents we're referring to and where they were located. When we think of monasteries, we often have a mental image of monks or nuns living in remote and even dramatic natural environments, testing their faith by surviving in difficult conditions, perched on mountaintops or rocky seaside cliffs, toiling away in desert climates. But monastic communities were actually woven into the fabric of urban environments in Renaissance Italy, such as the city of Florence, and that's where I'll focus my attention. Convents and monasteries grew in numbers in that city beginning in the 14th century under the influence of the mendicant orders. And mendicant monasticism, which began to form in Italy and in France during the early 13th century in reaction to the traditional Benedictine rule. That is the founder, St. Benedict's strict code of religious conduct, which dated back to the 6th century, and the mendicant orders, which included the Franciscans, the Dominicans, Augustinians, Carmelites, and Servites. They were all similarly devoted to an ascetic lifestyle of poverty and prayer. They also were developing their own principles and characteristics under the teachings of their of their individual founders, such as Dominic and Francis, who, according to tradition, actually met one another in Rome in 1215 when they were both there to seek confirmation of their monastic orders from Pope Gregory IX. And Dominic had a vision and a dream the night before, and so when he sees Francis, he recognizes and rushes to meet him in person. And, according to tradition, they maintained a close friendship and influenced one another's teachings. But mendicant monasteries, different from the earlier Benedictine rule, they located their communities in prosperous urban areas, such as Florence, where they preached to the local population while also relying upon the population for their charitable donations. So rather than being entirely self-sufficient communities, they depended upon their secular neighbors for assistance. And thus a relationship to the lay community was inherent to the existence of these monastic communities. The surrounding city could offer physical protection to the monasteries, while the dedicated prayers of the monastic communities provided an ongoing spiritual connection in return. And many monasteries and convents were therefore built very close to the city's walls. And so I'm showing you this image just so you can see that ring of walls around the city of Florence. And just so we can see an actual demonstration of that here with the Convento della Calza, which is located just inside of the Porta Romana, which is the southernmost port gateway in the city walls in Florence. And the convent entrance, which you can see on the right, sits just beside the Porta Romana. And so it effectively meant that the prayers of the nuns who lived in this convent permeated those stone fortifications and matched the physical strength of that stone with their own devotional force. Now, while mendicant monasticism provided a connection between religious and lay communities, this does not mean that friars, and more especially nuns, were out and about in the bustling city. Most orders practiced clausura, meaning their communities were cloistered or enclosed, observing their devotional obedience in seclusion from the urban environment outside their walls. But those walls were not impermeable, and while they physically restricted the movement of the women they housed, convents actually opened the worlds of these women to avenues of intellectual pursuits and creative exploration that would have been less available to them in secular society. And so they were cloistered. Women who became nuns actually had more opportunity for education and artistic expression than those women who married and had children. Now, the circumstances and stringency of clausura varied over time and between orders, but the original papal decree, which dates back to 1298, Periculoso, a mandate under Pope Boniface VIII, mandating that all nuns follow strict enclosure, regardless of the order of their regardless of their orders or the rules of their specific community. Yet for centuries, there had been papal dispensations granted, and orders would enact their own rules, and specific communities might grant some leniencies to these rules. But these deviations ended after the Council of Trent in 1563, with greater enforcement of Periculoso being observed in the decades that followed. And just in terms of thinking about what those tightened rules might have looked like, I know I was very struck last week with Amelia Leclerc's lecture of her image of the small window through which nuns received communion in San Maurizio, the church in Milan that she showed us, and how it represented these sort of contrasting aspects of their lives, that the sound of their voices was so highly valued, it brought them great respect and celebrity, and yet they were to be heard but not seen. They had the agency to compose and perform music, but only by staying hidden from the secular public as these otherworldly, disembodied voices. And I think it very well demonstrates what that experience would have been for cloistered women, especially after the Council of Trent. And even before the Council of Trent, enclosure was expected in the 15th century and the first half of the 16th century, but sisters did have opportunities to receive visits from their family members. In some cases, in limited instances, they might even be able to leave the convent to visit their families. That privilege was generally reserved for women from higher social classes and noble families who offered financial support to the convent that they were a part of. And this reminds us that the social class of community members carried over when they entered the convent. Women of lower classes were generally in the rank of servant sisters, converse or servigiali. They carried out the physical labor necessary to run the convent without taking the solemn vows. And they were expected to provide for and support the work of the regular nuns or the choir nuns, regolari or professe, who came from these higher social classes. The servant nuns came from families that could not provide the proper dowry necessary to become a nun, and so had another way of entering the community. Servant nuns were not the only sisters who performed duties in the convent, though, that regular nuns were also assigned less arduous work in various spaces within the convent campus, or they served in roles of high office positions that would range from being the abbess or prioress of the convent to being its recorder or even a convent pharmacist. And so while poorer families couldn't afford the dowry that might allow their daughters to enter these more coveted roles, on the other hand, we had wealthy families who might actually even pay extra so that their daughters may be exempt from performing any work or serving in any of these high offices. So indeed, convents really reflected a similar social hierarchy as the secular society outside of their walls. And they were understood to serve a social and economic function of housing and providing vocations to a city's population of women who did not or could not marry. And their charitable works of providing for the poor, of caring for and educating children, further demonstrates their role in providing for the social welfare of the city. The convent's enclosing walls and their potential permeability, I think, become most apparent when we think about the role that convents served as centers of education and artistic expression. And while we might think of the life of a nun as secluded or confined, we have to remember that while she was cloistered, a nun had access to an education, and that she might not be able to receive that same sort of education in the secular world. A nun was far more likely to be literate than her married sisters. And so we saw some examples of this on view, of course, in Strong Women, that a nun could dedicate her time to learning skills that might not otherwise be accessible to her. So not only reading, but also writing, that nuns were writing letters, writing poetry, writing diaries of the convent's activities, keeping their practical records, their accounting books, and so forth. She learned not only embroidery and lace making, but also about the production of the materials used in those arts. So as Marietta explained in her talk, the thread used in this table cover that's on view in the exhibition, that nuns actually produced that gold thread to make an object like this. They learned not only to sing or play instruments, but they were composing music of their own. They were not only performing in religious plays, but they were writing the scripts of those plays and directing their productions within their convents. And so I'm showing you here on the screen, this is the title page of a play text for a Sacra Rappresentazione that's on view in the gallery, a sacred play on view in the gallery, and just as a sort of example of the way that theater and drama was part of convent life as well. Nuns made drawings, they made miniatures, manuscript illuminations, and they even learned to paint, an artistic medium that was almost exclusive to male artists in this period, but which women could access in the convent. So let's shift our attention to the presence of art and artists in the monastery. In the 15th century, Florence's growing population of mendicant orders stimulated a burgeoning of construction of churches and of monasteries, and those new buildings provided opportunities for artists. And so though the members of the monastic communities relinquished their personal property and generally disavowed material possessions upon entering convent life, their surroundings were not as austere as we might expect. The friars and nuns of Florence's religious communities lived with images. They were found to varying degrees throughout a monastic complex in living spaces as well as sacred spaces of worship. And they were part of the daily rituals and routines of convent life, the scenery against which the lived experience of those convents took place. Their presence was valued. Images were considered essential items in the monastic environment. And the mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans and the Dominicans, promoted the didactic value of the visual arts, and in the process encouraged the patronage of devotional art in the lay community. And while they didn't necessarily allow for elaborate ornamentation in their own sacred spaces, they nevertheless accepted artistic production within the monastic communities as appropriate work activity, one that could prevent idleness, serve as a means of financial support to the members of the community, while also serving as an act of devotion. So this is an image that will probably look familiar to many. Art historians have long drawn association between the influence of mendicant teachings, which promoted communicative and personal experiences of faith, and the artistic innovations that initiated the early Renaissance period, beginning with Giotto di Bondone's revolutionary paintings in Padua in the early 14th century, with his artistic representations of divine subjects that became increasingly relatable and associated with the artist's observations of the natural world. And I include just this here just to remind us that Franciscan teachings in particular inspired religious reforms that called for intimate spiritual experiences and forms of devotion. And that included through visual images like the one that we see here. And this intimate and personal experience of faith was described in the Franciscan order's religious texts, such as The Journey of the Mind to God by St. Bonaventure, and the Meditations on the Life of Christ, which we have a copy on view in the Strong Women exhibition, and though has traditionally been attributed to an unknown follower of Bonaventure, the pseudo-Bonaventure, as Marietta explained in her lecture, was actually a text that was written for Franciscan nuns and possibly even written by a nun. But these and other Franciscan texts really emphasized a sympathetic approach to worship that focused upon Christ's humanity and the suffering that he endured. And to achieve this end, the order embraced the visual arts as a didactic instrument of prayer that could inspire passionate devotion from the viewer. Now, some of the most celebrated painters of the 15th century in Florence were mendicant friars, including Fra Angelico, a Dominican friar, and Fra Filippo Lippi, a Carmelite. And their presence and success indicate the circumstances of monasticism in Florence, where the mendicant orders had established this powerful influence and gained support from the laity far earlier than other cities in central and northern Italy, including Venice and Milan. The monastic communities were really poised to benefit from Florentine prosperity. And in return, Florence's intellectual and humanist-minded culture was receptive to the mendicant presentation of personal and engaging experiences of devotion. Now, perhaps the best surviving example of how a 15th century monastic community lived with images and housed artists within its communities is found in the living quarters of the Convent of San Marco, where the resident friars slept and prayed in small individual cells, adorned with small fresco paintings, primarily depicting scenes from the life of Christ, painted by Fra Angelico, who was a friar at San Marco. So each painting was the only ornamentation in these otherwise austere rooms and served as a focal point for prayer and contemplation. So thus the friars of San Marco were accustomed to living with a singular image and developing a relationship with that painted scene. In female communities, the sisters were similarly provided with objects and paintings as focal points for prayer in their private rooms. And these were often small panel paintings of the Virgin and Child or the sleeping Christ child, such as these examples by Barbara Longhi and Artemisia Gentileschi that are on view, of course, in the exhibition. These two artists were not themselves nuns, but we know that some devotional objects and artworks like these were created by members of female communities and would have been the focal points for prayer by the fellow sisters who lived in the communities with those artists. Okay, so I'd like to move now from the artworks in private cell rooms to communal living spaces in convents, and in particular, to the refectory. The refectory, or dining hall, was one of the most important communal spaces within a monastic complex. It was second only to the chapter house of a complex. And its immediate and continuous necessity meant that the refectory was one of the first structures to be built when a new campus, a new monastic campus was being constructed. And though it primarily functioned as a dining hall, the refectory's large size made it an ideal space for other types of communal gatherings. And so this would have included all sorts of ceremonies and celebrations for feast days, festae, for the mourning of deceased members of a community, and even for rituals of punishment for poor behavior. There was all sort of communal life that would have been happening in this space. So it accommodated the diverse activities of a monastic community and hosted dialogues between the brothers and sisters who experienced those spaces, as well as, in some cases, privileged guests in those spaces. And further, it was considered the most appropriate space to house works of art, after the church, of course, within the monastic complex. And so it's with all of this in mind that I turn our attention now to the typical monumental fresco painting that became associated with the refectory space in Renaissance Florence. And that, of course, is the Last Supper. And when I say the Last Supper, this is probably what comes to everyone's mind. It is the ubiquitous image of the Last Supper being, of course, Leonardo da Vinci's fresco at the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, not in Florence, painted around 1495 to 98. But Leonardo's painting is part of a multi-century tradition that began in Florence in the mid-14th century, and it developed throughout the 15th century and would continue to thrive after Leonardo in the 16th century, both in Florence and beyond. So I'd like to give you a brief overview of this long history. I won't go through every cenacolo that's on the list that's provided on your handout, which is quite long. But I want to highlight some of the particularly innovative examples and thinking about them again in the context of the lived experience of a monastic community. So again, the monastic refectory primarily functioned as a dining hall, and making Christ's last meal and the institution of the Eucharist fitting iconography to decorate that space. But before the mid-15th century, the crucifixion was actually the most common iconography painted in refectories, and it's represented here in a scene from the life of Saint Benedict, a cycle that was painted by Sodoma around 1505 in the great cloister of the Abbey of Monte Oliveto Maggiore. And so I show you this image just to give you an example of, as you can see, the crucifixion scene painted on the rear wall of this painted refectory space, the type of devotional images that preceded the Last Supper in this space. In some instances, the crucifixion would be joined with other episodes from the Passion cycle, and would be paired with devotional figures or scenes that were associated with a relevant saint, associated with a community. And this carries over into the first Last Supper fresco to be painted in a Florentine refectory. It falls into this category of being situated amongst other devotional images that would have been read in association with one another. So in the mid-14th century, Taddeo Gaddi painted the wall of the refectory of Santa Croce, a Franciscan community of friars. And he paints here this essentially a monumental altarpiece, as if the wall were composed of multiple panels. And stretching across the bottom of this wall is the scene of the Last Supper. It essentially serves as a predella, the long horizontal register that usually is found at the base of an altarpiece. And here, as in this role as a predella to the wall, Gaddi's Last Supper, he relates to the iconography above, which is representing the tree of life, surrounded by 4 miracle scenes. And just to see it a little bit more clearly, in the tree of life, Christ's body on the cross forms the tree trunk, while scrolls of text shape the branches that hold ornaments depicting the important figures of his Old Testament lineage. And this iconography combines the tree of Genesis with the cross of the New Testament and asserts that the crucifixion will fulfill the sacrifices that Christ foreshadows in the Last Supper scene below. And so the friars who are in this space would meditate upon these images and draw out those connections. The Last Supper narrative appears in all 4 New Testament Gospels, with varying degrees of dialogue and details in each. And the Gospels of Mark and Luke both begin their accounts by locating the event of the Last Supper in a large upstairs room in the home of an unidentified man in Jerusalem, as instructed by Christ. And this upper room, or cenacle, the cenacolo in Italian, is the descriptive title that's given to these monumental refectory paintings, cenacoli. So there's this direct association between these painted scenes, the iconography of the scenes, with a real physical space, the real space in which the Last Supper, the event, occurred. Now, after his disciples prepare the space for the Passover Seder, Christ joins them on the evening of the first day of unleavened bread. And in this setting of a communal and ceremonial meal, he speaks to his disciples on matters that will, of course, be central to Christian doctrine. And I apologize for the poor quality of this image, but the Last Supper scene was damaged in the flooding that happened in Florence of 1966. And so you can see that in comparison to the scenes above, there is greater loss, unfortunately, in the Last Supper scene. So if it's a bit difficult to read, I apologize. Okay, so all 4 evangelists convey Christ's message that one of the disciples will betray him. And the singled out figure of Judas in Gaddi's painting makes clear that he is the betrayer. Of course, the only figure sitting on the opposite side of the table with his back to the viewer, a diminutive figure kind of singled out from the righteous peers on the other side of the table. And in the synoptic gospels, those of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Christ also, of course, shares the essential message that in his memory, the disciples should eat bread and drink wine, and thus instituting the Eucharist. A knowledgeable viewer, a friar in this space, could mentally provide the familiar scripture that informed this painted iconography. This is my body, this is my blood, the blood of the covenant shed for many. That could be mentally provided by the viewer, and in a sense then, the scene unfolds before them. So they could further relate the scene then up to the larger passion narrative and the message of Christ's sacrifice as foretold during the Last Supper. Now, Taddeo Gaddi's horizontal layout of the Last Supper obviously naturally fits this broad wall of the refectory, and the long rectangular format allowed the artist to arrange Christ and his disciples on one side of the table facing their audience. They mirror the arrangement of the bench and table-lined walls of the refectory. And so I once again show you here the fresco by Sodoma and the view of an active refectory at San Francisco in Fiesole, just to illustrate the actual arrangement of the refectory and how it really does mirror the format of the Last Supper itself. Okay. So this, therefore, making Gaddi's fresco, encouraging a sense of correspondence between the viewer's physical space and their physical experience sitting at the table as painted in the scene, and then thereby the Last Supper scene becomes sort of the head table within the refectory in this sort of unified sense of space. And the representation of the straight table actually reshaped the circular or semicircular shape that was more commonly found in earlier depictions of this subject, and seen here, for example, this is the mid-13th century mosaic on the ceiling of Florence's baptistry, just as an example. Now, while the introduction of a horizontal table in the 14th century, it may seem like a mundane detail, but it suggests this shift in the relationship between the representation of the Last Supper and the space of its reception, and the viewer's experience of that space. So this seemingly simple change of the table's shape, in fact, is an indication of a larger pivot that's happening in the iconography's meaning and in the viewing experience, from being not merely a divine symbol, but a temporal event, and one that could be experienced by the monastic community. And artists thereafter would repeat the format established by Gaddi, presenting this unobstructed arrangement of figures along the table, creating this open and stage-like view that enhanced the performative quality of the composition and its association with the space of reception. So the first known cenacolo of the 15th century is this fresco painted in 1447 by Andrea del Castagno at the convent of Santa Apollonia. It's situated in a cloistered women's community, and Castagno's fresco was therefore inaccessible to the public and generally unknown to scholars even before the late 19th century, when it was publicly opened for the first time. It, like other monastic houses, had been closed during the suppression of religious institutions in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was subsequently even used actually as a warehouse for military storage. So it really wasn't known until the 19th century and is not even included in Giorgio Vasari's biography of the artist. Now, like Gaddi, Castagno included his Last Supper as part of a larger program of frescoes on the east wall of the refectory, placing it beneath scenes of the resurrection, the crucifixion, and entombment in this order, from left to right. And the scenes juxtaposed above the cenacle were intended to be read in conjunction with the Last Supper, just like with the Tree of Life at Santa Croce. Together, these four narrative scenes form the theology of the Eucharist and from its institution to its fulfillment. And so while it lacks an altar and the space does not serve as a chapel, the refectory was nevertheless a charged devotional space. Performance of the Eucharistic ritual didn't happen here, but meditation on its inception and its meaning were expected in this space. Also like Gaudi, Castagno sort of pitches the Last Supper scene forward from the wall toward the viewer's space. He frames the scene with an architectural interior that falls behind the figures, pushing them forward from the wall, and thereby creating this desired effect of a shared space with the refectory. Now, contrasting Gaudi's predella-like composition, however, Castagno's cenacolo is the largest scene on the refectory wall and was presumably of central importance to its monastic audience. And this shift in emphasis from the crucifixion to the Last Supper focused the viewer's attention and allowed them to feel a greater sense of semblance with the subject and the figures. The sisters of Santa Polonia could relate to the experience of the communal meal depicted on their wall, and through prayer and meditation, they could extend that empathy to the sacred events that unfolded at and after the Last Supper. Now, we can imagine that in a community of friars, the association with the represented brotherhood of the Last Supper was perhaps even stronger, but it was nevertheless relatable for a community of women as well. Now, despite their unity around the table, each disciple figure is an isolated individual. None of them looks directly at Christ, or even those who react to the gestures of expressions of their neighbor do so within their own limited personal space. Yet, while their temperaments may seem subdued, they are nevertheless powerful figures. Their small gestures, hands that are raised or clasped or pointing, rested beneath their chins, held against their faces, all of these gestures communicate these inner sentiments of distress, of contemplation, which together would form the iconography of the Last Supper narrative that, again, the sisters in this space were intended to be meditating upon. Just briefly show just a detail of the central figures here of Christ and Judas, flanked by Saints Peter and John, just as a visual reference so we can kind of see how this tradition carries on into the 15th century, and the fact that there is sort of a formal type, that we are developing a formal picture type that artists have begun to repeat. Okay. So Castagno's figures really conform to this tense and even harsh style for which this artist was known. The strong contrasts of light and dark, the vivid use of color and pattern enhanced each figure's sense of autonomy, but also could have come across as stiff. And I think by contrast, now we'll move to the representation of figures whose interactions soften in the cenacoli painted in the last quarter of the 15th century, as seen here with Domenico Ghirlandaio's fresco at the Convent of Ognissanti. Now, of the 12 known cenacoli painted in and around Florence between the early 14th and the end of the 15th centuries, Domenico Ghirlandaio in his workshop painted 4 of those frescoes, which constitute, of course, roughly a third of the cenacoli produced in early Renaissance Florence, and I think speaks to Domenico Ghirlandaio's career and popularity as sort of this steadfast storyteller who led an enormous workshop of young artists. He painted his first cenacolo in 1476, with the help of his brother Davide, at the Abbey of San Michele Arcangelo at Passignano, better known as Badia a Passignano, which was a Vallambrosian monastic abbey located about 70 miles south of Florence. And here he added his Last Supper beneath two existing lunette paintings by Bernardo di Stefano Rosselli, depicting the expulsion of Adam and Eve and the story of Cain and Abel, which were painted around 1474, so just slightly before Domenico Ghirlandaio's Last Supper. And though he's working about 30 years after Andrea del Castagno, in this first version that Ghirlandaio paints, he seems to follow Andrea del Castagno as a prototype for his picture. There's this strong architectural setting that's emphasizing this enclosed interior, much like the cloistered space of the communities who would have eaten before them, both at, of course, at Santa Bologna and here at Badia Passignano as well. Ghirlandaio's figures enjoy a more spacious arrangement, and although their poses are rather formal and confined, their contemplative expressions and their calm gestures are softer and more naturalistic than those of his predecessor. Now, for both his second and third treatments of the subject, painted in the refectories of San Marco on the left and Ognissanti on the right, Ghirlandaio made an important change to his composition. He eliminates the additional narrative scenes. We're no longer relating the Last Supper to other narratives that precede or follow the Last Supper story. He enlarges the Last Supper instead to cover the entire refectory wall. And with this singular focus, he represents another important change in the Florentine development of the monumental Last Supper. It allowed for this exclusive reading of the subject, while also creating an even greater sense of engagement and integration between the pictorial space of the fresco and the physical space of the refectory. You can see that the table is no longer the flat horizontal line introduced by Gaddi, but it has these perpendicular sections at each of its ends, creating this U shape that reaches out and reaches forward toward the viewer's space, while also emphasizing the three-dimensionality of the painted scene. He also replaces the strict interior setting, the architectural emphasis of Castagno's cenacle, with this open loggia that gives us a view of this airy garden directly behind the cenacle, ostensibly paradise. And this lush vegetation, with the identifiable cypress and palm and fruit trees that symbolize these themes of sacrifice, fertility, and salvation that may have appeared in other devotional scenes in the earlier cenacoli, here are instead symbolically represented by, again, these trees, or as well as the birds. The contemplative stillness of the seated figures really contrasts with these soaring representations of birds in flight, and again, with each species relating to a traditional symbolic and thematic meaning. And further, this open air setting incorporates natural light, which creates that softening and modeling of figures and forms throughout the composition. And this is particularly true at Ognissanti. And so just to show you some details here of the Ognissanti fresco, we can see Christ and his disciples sitting here on a bench against this clearly a wooden partition. The visible roughness of the grain of the lumber behind them. Judas appears more reactive and aggressive here than he had in the earlier paintings by Gaddi and Andrea del Castagno. And his left hand, clutching the coin purse against his hip, the payment he received for his betrayal, as he looks at Peter with this defiant expression. And so the apostle figures at Ognissanti, they are no longer these really contained and isolated figures, but are instead paired off to allow for this greater sense of conversation in gesture and expression and arrangement between the men and this sort of sense of an active discourse taking place at the Last Supper table. Some of the figures gaze out from the composition, and they're implying not only their awareness of the spectators' presence, but directly engaging them in conversations and as active participants of the narrative and the dialogue. So again, the friar or nun providing the scripture that they know so well. And similarly, the painted architectural elements join with the matching components in the refectory space itself, and bridging, again, the pictorial and the real into a unified setting. Ghirlandaio's Cenacolo was finished in the same year that the refectory was actually built, in this case, in 1482, and it does seem to be sort of this organic element of the room's design. The painted scene is set in a scale with the actual room, and making the pictorial space appear to be an extension of this real environment. You know, the vaulted ceiling of the painted scene represents the vaulted structure of the refectory, and again, it transitions us from painted and real spaces. And it implies then that the sacred scene of the Last Supper projects off of the wall. It takes place in a space that extends from the room, that's occupied by its beholders. And this unification of painting and architecture generates a sense of tension between the surface of the wall and the three-dimensional space itself, which really, again, shapes the viewer's experience. And accepting the illusion of a shared architectural space allows the viewer to imagine the Last Supper scene unfolding in his or her own environment. Now, nevertheless, the separation of these spaces is denoted in two important ways. First, the painted figures of Christ and his apostles are larger than the viewers. They're about 1.5 life size. And their scale really gives the figures a monumental presence in the space, while also representing an appropriate sense of hierarchy over their secular viewers. And second, they are not at ground level with the viewer, but as in earlier Cenacoli, they're raised approximately 10 feet off the floor. And this practical advantage of the elevation of the picture enhanced, of course, the visibility in the refectory, and at the same time giving that clear sense of hierarchy and separation between sacred and secular worlds. Now, Ghirlandaio's repeated treatments confirm that the iconography's presence in the dining halls of Florentine monastic communities was well established in Florence by the end of the 15th century. And while he certainly modeled his paintings on the earlier prototypes, the changes that Ghirlandaio made to his compositions transformed the function of the Last Supper painting and its correlation to the refectory space. And he sets forth this artistic approach to the iconography that would evolve over the following century. So with Ghirlandaio, the Last Supper becomes an autonomous image on the refectory wall, while at the same time developing an increasingly united relationship with the architectural conditions of the refectory, as well as the audience within that space. So let's return then to think about the communities who were in these spaces, who lived with and experienced the refectory and its cenacolo. So when serving as a space for communal dining, the refectory essentially encouraged the monks or nuns to mirror the painted disciples in the Last Supper scene. So while consuming their meal, the viewer contemplated Christ's last, and thereby not only meditating upon, but also participating in the iconography. You know, he or she responded to and perhaps even mimicked the emotional and the psychological responses of the disciples that we've now seen on display in especially Ghirlandaio and Andrea del Castagno's paintings. So as if they were present in the same physical environment and responding to the same unfolding events. The refectory was a venue of shared consumption for its members of a religious community. A place both of holy eating to provide physical and spiritual nourishment under the guidance and at sometimes the strict rules of their order. And the necessity of daily ingestion, of course, carried over layers of symbolic meaning and methods of social order in the context of the monastic refectory. Assigned seats and choreographed movements organized each brother or sister by her rank in the community. And while entering or leaving, or anytime just being present in this space, again, these assignments and movements were prescribed. And so these instructions were codified in texts, and such as the constitutions of the Dominican order, and here reformulated by the General Chapter in 1505, which details the expected behavior in a male community, but which would have applied to female communities as well. So we see, it says here, the brothers must go silently, but with a rapid advance to the place where they will wash their hands. Wash your hands, then go in the usual order to sit on the bench outside the refectory, and in that position, recite the De Profundis. When the prior finally sounds for entry into the refectory, they must enter 2 by 2, starting with the youngest, and when they are in the middle of the refectory, they must bow to the cross or the painted image placed there, and having made the sign of the cross, they must sit at the table. So thus, like all other aspects of monastic life, mealtime followed a very regimented schedule and ceremony of activities and choreography of movements that were imposed by the order of a given religious community. And this also would usually include a directive to eat in silence, but while listening to one of their members read a passage from Scripture. And some refectories included a pulpit, a designated place reserved for the reader to stand and recite the prayer or passages from the Scripture selected for the occasion. And so, for example, at Ognissanti and at Badia Passignano, where, again, Ghirlandaio painted 2 of his cenacoli, the pulpit was actually built into the wall at an elevated height and reached, by an internal staircase. We don't have similar examples that survive from female communities, and they were perhaps less common in female convents, but the reading and listening of Scripture was nevertheless essential for those spaces. Now, the development of the refectory cenacoli tradition really extended the sensory experience to the diner's eyes as well. The monastic community was generally instructed to listen and to remain so focused upon the spoken words that they should not let their eyes stray from the food before them. So consider, for example, St. Bonaventure's strict remarks in the Specchio della Disciplina, where he says, "When you are at table, you should not turn your eyes looking now here, now there, but be so disciplined that you do not even know who is sitting next to you or what he is doing, so that you can be intent on reflection or on thoughts of God or on the reading." So what do we do with this after talking about these cenacoli? Well, I think, but despite this rule against looking, scholars argue that the presence of the art in the refectory meant that engagement with devotional iconography during mealtimes was inherent to that space, as it was to the other spaces in which these communities lived. And that contemplation of the Last Supper was as much a function of the refectory as eating the meals in the space. And the correspondence, again, between the painted subject and the viewer's mealtime activity related to the increasing popularity of the Last Supper, specifically for refectories, but not in other spaces. So we generally don't attempt to reconcile the seeming disconnect between the restriction against looking and the actual reception of refectory paintings. I think what's key is St. Bonaventure's instruction to focus, a resolute state of mind and body to guide a humble friar or nun towards spiritual revelation and harmony. And the presence of the Last Supper suggests that it too could be a focal point for such a meditative exercise. Now, what about when it wasn't mealtime? Because, of course, as I said, the refectory was a multifunction communal space. And I would argue that the circulation of bodies and the dynamic, multisensory activities that occurred in this space, which would have included the meeting, again, of community members for various reasons, as well as the performance of sacred plays, that the members of the lay community even being present for some of those performances, that kind of activity would have further activated the picture and this understanding of a connection between painted and real. Okay. So Leonardo's famous Last Supper is not in Florence, but it does bear a place in this discussion because, of course, Leonardo trained and established his career in Florence before leaving that city in 1482 to head to Milan as a diplomatic gift from Lorenzo de' Medici to Ludovico Sforza. And it was probably Ludovico Sforza who was the patron for his cenacolo at Santa Maria delle Grazie. And we can see his initials and those of his wife, Beatrice d'Este, which were added to the central lunette over the Last Supper alongside the Sforza coat of arms after he became Duke of Milan. And Leonardo certainly modeled his composition and its relationship again to the refectory space on the Florentine prototypes that he would have known, and representing them as an extension of the room of the cenacolo. At the same time, he also introduced changes, again, to the traditional format, so another important point of change. And of course, notably, the fact that Judas has moved to the same side of the table as Christ and the other disciples. He replaces the U-shaped, high-backed booth with a straight horizontal table, one like the one painted by Gaddi at Santa Croce. And he gives us this open view of the surrounding cenacle space with windows that frame the exterior landscape, as well as the head of Christ and these central figures. You know, the representation of halos has diminished in the previous decades, and here Leonardo eliminates them entirely. But Leonardo's Last Supper is perhaps most celebrated for its poignant and communicative figures, and the disciples who are erupting in lively gestures and conversations, caught in this moment of emotional candor, in contrast to the more quiet and introspective expressions of Ghirlandaio's figures, gathering in clusters of three, each representing discernible reactions to Christ, seated at the table, the center of the table with his hands outstretched, this sort of stable pyramid from which the composition radiates. And as in Florence, the engaged audience in Milan understands the composition as an unfolding event, and the monastic viewer providing the scripture, the dialogue of the scene, and thereby inciting this sort of performance of the Eucharist narrative. And it seems that Leonardo imagined the painting in this way, as a performance. He wrote a brief description in a small parchment-bound notebook detailing the gestures and appearances of his figures, providing these important insights of his plans for the composition, almost like a screenplay. And though he doesn't eventually incorporate all of these actions into his painting, I think they nevertheless demonstrate his attention to gestures as a means to communicate the thoughts of the individual figures and their roles in the narrative. He says, one who was drinking has left his glass in the place and turned his head toward the speaker. Another wrings the fingers of his hands and turns with a frown to his companion. Another, with hands spread open to show the palms, shrugs his shoulders up to his ears and mouths astonishment, and so on. And while we have Leonardo's written words here, I think it's a similar sense that can be applied to those earlier Florentine cenacoli as well, that this idea of a performance unfolding before the friars or nuns, the community in this space, and again, that sense of connection between painted and real. Okay. So Leonardo's Last Supper drew immediate interest and attention, and that which of course continues to this day, and it became a touchstone for other artists who visited the refectory to study the drawing, to study and draw the composition, and help to further circulate its fame and its influence. And so here, for example, I'm showing you an example from the MFA's print collection, a print made by Sootman after a drawing by Rubens. So demonstrating the circulation of the image among artists and sort of this lineage, painted by Leonardo, drawn by Rubens, and printed by Suitman. And so we can see then how Leonardo's painting becomes, again, part of this multi-century dialogue, and it's one that continued to thrive in Milan, in Florence, and well beyond in the 16th century. And so even though his work historically cast this shadow over the Last Supper paintings in Florence that preceded it, I think it's important to keep in mind that Leonardo's fresco is neither an endpoint nor a starting point of this narrative. Rather, it represents both the continuation of an established tradition and a moment of innovation that marked a stylistic pivot from the 15th to the 16th century. And so just focusing once again on Florence, just to kind of see then how that dialogue continues in this city. Again, the familiar compositional format that developed in the 15th century continues here with artists at the convent, Della Calza, which I showed you at the beginning of this talk, situated beside the Porta Romana, as well as this still active refectory at San Francesco in Fiesole. They're preserving this, again, the same arrangement of these quietly reactive figures, this architectural space that extends this into the setting of the refectory. At San Michele a San Salvi, this Last Supper by Andrea del Sarto repeats the general structure of the Florentine composition, but his expressive figures are even more dynamic, more dramatic, responsive, and were likely influenced directly by Leonardo, as were Alessandro Allori at Santa Maria del Carmine and Giorgio Vasari at L'Ermerate. But we need to add another artist to this list, and it's one that has long been left out of this narrative of the Cenacoli tradition. And that is Suor Plautilla Nelli, Sister Plautilla Nelli. This Cenacolo by Suor Plautilla Nelli has largely been missing from the scholarship on this picture type. And thanks to its recent restoration and installation in the museum connected to the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella, it's rightfully been reinserted into this narrative where it really has always belonged. It is the first and only Cenacolo of the early modern period by a female artist, and it is the largest painting by an early modern female artist. It's also signed, and I draw your attention where it is signed in the upper left corner here. It's signed not only with the artist's name, but also a clear statement about the creator as a woman. Es Plautilla, orate pro pictora. Pray for the paintress. Pictora being female painter. She is making a clear statement about who it is that has painted this work. And she didn't paint it on her own. She would have had an entire workshop of nuns who assisted her in this work. Now, while Plautilla's name might seem new to you, she is not entirely unknown to art historians. She received scholarly attention beginning in her own lifetime, that she was included in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, one of the 4 women he included. And in his first edition in 1550, he simply refers to her as a nun who paints. But by his second edition in 1568, which is the year, of course, that the Last Supper was completed, he's expanded the biography. More recently, she's drawn increasing interest and attention from scholars, really dating back to the 1970s as part of the increasing efforts to shed light on women artists who have traditionally been left out of the canon. And that included a symposium dedicated to her work in 1998, an exhibition of her work at the Uffizi in 2017, and of course the restoration of this painting, which just occurred between 2015 and 2019 with the support of the Advancing Women Artists, which is a US-based nonprofit organization, and the AWA led a campaign to not only raise money for the restoration, but also to raise awareness of the painting, generated public interest, and was really a crowd-funded project. And the unveiling of the restored painting just in 2019 was a widespread, international, received widespread, I should say, international media coverage. So what do we know about Plautilla Nelli? Polissena Margherita Nelli was born in Florence in 1524, and she adopted the name Plautilla upon taking her vows and joining the convent of Santa Caterina da Siena in 1538, where her older sister Constanza was already a nun at the same convent. And Plautilla would spend her entire life here. She enters when she's 14, and she dies in 1588 at the age of 64. She presided as the prioress of the convent at different times, making her the highest ranking member of the community. And so she was clearly a leader and a role model to the women in her community. And that included, again, the women in the workshop that she led and who painted the Last Supper with her. So I'll just quickly show that her convent, seen on the right here, is literally adjacent, perpendicular to San Marco on the left. So this truly side by side, these two Dominican institutions, San Marco, again, housing friars that had included Fra Angelico, and so a similar interest in fostering artists within the monastic community than at Santa Caterina. So Plautilla and her workshop, they completed this very large oil on canvas painting. It's 21 feet long and 6 feet tall. And the medium is oil on canvas, so it departs from the traditional fresco trinacolo, and suggesting this shift towards oil on canvas as primary materials of painting by the mid-16th century. But it may also be why the painting survives. It could be rolled up and stored away after the dissolution of the convents, again, during the suppression of houses of worship in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, that rather than being removed or covered by a layer of plaster, that it was rolled up and ended up at Santa Maria Novella instead. Now, the large scale alone of the Last Supper makes it exceptional. Nuns, we know, generally painted on a smaller scale. And again, these are not nuns who painted these two images, but I use them as an example of, again, those small panel paintings that would have been used for private devotion, both by nuns and in private homes. And so again, generally the smaller scale at which all women artists painted during this period. And Swarnelli painted similar types of small panel paintings for her sisters at Santa Caterina, like Fra Angelico did, but also she sold her work, and it was collected by Florence's wealthy noble families, and it's one of the things that Vasari actually takes note of in her success, that she was widely collected. And such works as these are now on display at the museum that's actually associated with the Cenacolo by Andrea del Sarto, the former convent of San Salvi. So how did Plautilla Nelli learn to paint? And so as we know from the earlier lectures in this course, that women were largely excluded from learning to paint in the traditional system of Florentine workshops. And so artists like Artemisia Gentileschi and Lavinia Fontana were fortunate to come from families of artists. Sophonisba Anguissola's father recognized her great talent and supported her education and training. Plautilla likely didn't find her calling as a painter until she entered the convent, and where she had access and opportunities, again, that would not have been available to her necessarily in the lay community. It's unclear if she was a student of another artist, though scholars have named various Dominican friar artists who may have guided her, thanks again to that close proximity between Santa Caterina and San Marco. She received collections of drawings and sketches by various artists, which likely included a collection of in the possession of San Marco, and specifically one of its resident artists, Friar Paulino. And among that collection were drawings by Fra Bartolomeo, another earlier friar artist in San Marco. And Fra Bartolomeo seems to have been an important influence to Plautilla. It's been suggested that sets of drawings by Fra Bartolomeo may have actually informed the figures that Plautilla painted in her Last Supper scene. But she was probably largely self-taught and drew inspiration from the works of art that she had access to in her convent. So just to look a little bit more closely at her painting, it's far more focused and simple than those painted by her male predecessors, which is partly a result of, again, the medium on canvas. She was not filling an entire refectory wall with fresco. But she gives similar attention to the various materials and the contrasting textures in her painting. Smooth, transparent glass vessels, opaque metal stems on the glassware, rough crusted bread, spread across the table's surface. That she was painting these objects from life, and including various forms of glassware and food items. And just for sake of time, I'll just quickly pass over some of these. She was also paying careful attention to anatomy, such as the representation of figures' hands and the creases in their palms and flesh over bone and tendons. So she is clearly expressing similar interests as her male predecessors. And it does raise the question, what knowledge did she have of those other cenacoli in Florence? Did she have access to those other works? It's possible she had access to Andrea del Castagno's painting, as it was in a cloistered female community, so she, as a nun, perhaps could have accessed that space. It's also possible she could have entered San Marco, the adjacent monastery, to see Domenico Ghirlandaio's painting. The convent of Della Calza, another female house, has also been suggested as a space that Plautilla could have entered and been familiar with its cenacolo. And again, that circulation of images of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper also probably made their way to Plautilla Nelli, and it's been suggested that she's quoted some of specific figures in her own cenacolo. I think, for example, the Leonardo, the third figure from the left with two hands raised, and Plautilla Nelli's fourth figure from the left in a similar pose. But I think we also need to keep in mind that while she's interested in her male predecessors, she also is adding her own innovations and her own details that make the composition her own and make this, again, the work of a paintress. The details of the bag that Judas holds were revealed when this painting was conserved, and it's been identified specifically as a small leather pouch embroidered with flowers. And it's the type of object that would have been made by a woman. And I think its inclusion here, we can wonder if this is an intentional tribute even to her fellow women artists, and perhaps another nun in her community, that she's inserting this object into her painting, but also into this narrative as part of this larger narrative from which they've been excluded. And so I like to think of Plautilla Nelli's Last Supper and the restoration of this painting. Much like the exhibition of Strong Women, it reminds us that while we think we know the narrative of the Italian Renaissance, it seems so familiar, so much ink has been spilled about it, there's obviously still much more to learn. And the attention being given to Plautilla Nelli's Last Supper has really shed light on women artists, and in particular on self-taught women artists in monastic communities. But again, I think there are still more stories to uncover. And I'm sure that as art historians continue to find this hidden gold and bring it to the surface, we will develop a fuller picture of this period. So thank you all for your attention.
Folks, we have time for a few questions. I have a mic coming around if you would like to raise your hand.
Yes, I wondered if the women worked on tapestries or if embroidery or needlepoint existed at this point.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So working on textiles, embroidery, lace making were absolutely the sort of objects that women also would have been working on both in the convent and in their homes. But yes, it was certainly sort of the art form I think that we most often associate with women artists. But we can see that other mediums, such as painting, were available to them as well in the convents. Yeah, I don't know if Paige can get across the room.
Hi, thank you so much. I was particularly interested in a note that you have about the Chinocole that it was in Le Mirate. Is there a paper trail that shows where the artworks from that convent went? Or
Sorry, where the painting went?
Where yes, how it happened to get to Santa Croce?
And so that was the one painted by Giorgio Vasari.
Right.
And it is, I think it's oil on wood panel. It's not canvas, but it's not a fresco. And it's a bit far back in my slides. But yes, it actually was restored at almost the same time that Plautilla Nelli's Last Supper was being restored. And so, but yes, it too, again, during this suppression of these religious communities, that works of art like that were removed and eventually rehoused. And that building in particular, which is no longer a monastic building. But yes, it was also restored and now hangs in Santa Croce in the same refectory with Taddeo Gaddi's fresco. Yeah.
So my question is, being such a patriarchal society, were these women welcomed into the art world, number one? And number two, for a fresco of any substantial size, I suppose staging was needed, and also applying the plaster was necessary. Did they have assistance, or were they responsible for doing all this in light of men not caring what a woman did?
Well, so we know, for your first question, we know that Plautilla Nelli, these smaller panel paintings, were collected by beyond her convent. That wealthy collectors in Florence, that they actually sought out paintings by Plautilla Nelli. So she certainly did have a reputation, a respected reputation as an artist in Florence in her own lifetime. And again, that she was included in Vasari's biographies speaks to that as well. Now, her Last Supper is not a fresco, so it would not have been the same fresco process, but yes, all of the Chinocoli painted in fresco were painted not only by their lead artists, but by a workshop that would have been involved in preparing of the materials, the spreading of plaster. I don't know if Plautilla Nelli, if there are any, if she ever painted in fresco or not. I'm just not aware if that was a medium she ever worked in, but she did have a workshop of nuns. This was, this painting was by Plautilla as well as her fellow nuns. And so, yes, she would have had assistance in the same way that Domenico Ghirlandaio and Leonardo da Vinci had assistance in their work. But I think, seeing her and understanding her process as, in many ways, being no different than her male counterparts, but the possibility, the opportunity to even create such a work was only allowed to her within the convent, that would have been possible. Yeah.
More question.
Thank you. Great lecture, thank you. I was wondering if you had any sense of the influences of Nelli's technique in changing over to oil on canvas rather than the traditional fresco technique for covering large spaces, such as in the Cenacoli. Did she have access to what was going on in the 16th century in terms of materials and techniques that other artists were starting to paint oil on canvas? If she only had limited access to other monasteries, which would have been painted in the true fresco technique?
Right. So it is a good question. The what did she have access to, and what did she know, and how did she gain access to it? I mean, when this painting was conserved, the scientific study that went on made very clear that she was working in the materials and in the techniques of her time, and that she is part of, at this point, this shift towards painting in oil on canvas. So she was certainly working in the medium of her time. She would have had, the access, again, to two things in her own convent or related communities that were themselves, filled with works of art. And so I think that she probably did have more access to learn from other artists than we might assume. It's hard to be able to piece together exactly, what she knew and where she learned it from. But I think, again, it speaks to the fact that, yes, she was cloistered, but those walls were not impenetrable, that she was able to learn and have a very successful career and work in the same techniques of the other artists of her time.
Thank you, folks. If you want to leave your surveys with our ushers at the top of the stairs, that would be great. And next week starts our next course, Fashion by Sargent. Same time, same place, so check that out on the website if you haven't already.
Thank you.